Everyone in this debate recognises the immense dislocation caused by major corporations leaving a town that's dependent on its presence. The real issue in this debate is, can these costs be shared in an efficient way which leads to better outcomes for these workers and for this town? We've shown you how placing this obligation on corporations means there's a greater incentive to promote the kind of practices in these towns which accelerates their recovery. We believe that's the essential core of the social benefit that can be achieved through our society. Three questions. Firstly, does this undermine the state's willingness and obligation to invest in these types of programs? Secondly, how will corporations react to our plan? And thirdly, do corporations have an obligation to bear some of the cost? So firstly, how will this impact the state's obligations? We believe that it's incredibly difficult for states to bear all of the costs associated in this debate. You look at areas like states like Michigan, which face economic devastation under the status quo. It's incredibly difficult for them to bear the burden of all of this retraining, ladies and gentlemen. Moreover, states are trapped in a difficult bind. The difficult bind is they have an incentive to lure corporations to ensure they stay, to give them concessions to reinvigorate particular towns. But that concession, that incentive, often comes at the expense of ensuring a multi-dimensional town that has the capacity to diversify and move into different products. For that reason, ladies and gentlemen, states often are in a structural bind, which means they can't act to efficiently ensure the best practices. We say when we transfer some of that responsibility of corporations to ensure that their workers have the skills and have the training to actually be able to survive in the economy, that's a more efficient burden allocation and means you're going to get more benefits for those workers, ladies and gentlemen. What we heard from the closing opposition, ladies and gentlemen, is that states simply will lose their incentive to further the policies, to retrain, to improve the lives of these people, ladies and gentlemen. We see there's a clear incentive for the state to promote welfare policies where they're necessary. The perfect example is Obamacare. Ladies and gentlemen, corporations provide health insurance to their workers, but when the state recognises a major failure in the corporate ability to provide those services, they step in to augment that provision, ladies and gentlemen, because that's what's politically necessary. People aren't willing to support second-rate practices, ladies and gentlemen. What we had furthermore from Swain on this point is, you know what, this is a crucial signal because often these problems have existed for a long time. The state has failed to act. I've already mentioned the structural bind affecting states, but the additional point, ladies and gentlemen, is we need to prevent towns from becoming mono-industrialised in the first place. The way you do that is through our plan, ladies and gentlemen, when you give companies incentives to ensure that workers are capable of moving into different sectors. No, thank you. Finally, on their extension, we heard about unions, ladies and gentlemen, how this gives them additional power. We say, ladies and gentlemen, unions can't stop all labour movement, ladies and gentlemen. If it's still cheaper to move your production, if it's still cheaper to change, then that's still going to happen ultimately, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. So, how will companies react?
Before we move on.
No, thank you. So let's firstly look at the impact on the capacity of corporations to produce goods. What we've shown you, ladies and gentlemen, is if it's still cheaper for these companies to move their production, they will do so. What they will do is factor these costs into their long-term planning. And what they've taken is this really simplistic conception of corporations. The corporation will be going along brilliantly and they'll suddenly realise there's this huge financial burden on their books. No, they'll slowly invest in those things. They'll slowly build up a fund of money which allows them to prepare for this risk. It's basic risk management that corporations engage in all the time, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. We say, ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, corporations have an obligation to prepare for this cost. Yes?
So that sounds a lot like exactly what happened in Detroit in the 1960s and 70s when they had these massive financial long-term obligations that drove American auto manufacturers into bankruptcy. How is legally enforcing all of that going to solve the problem you described?
We say, ladies and gentlemen, that if corporations are as profit-obsessed and rational as your side tries to make them out to be, they will factor in these costs into their planning. That's the basic premise, ladies and gentlemen, of corporate incentives which you have defended. So furthermore, let's look at this issue of early redundancies that we heard from Swain. So what we heard is that corporations are going to get rid of people more quickly. We say if that's the case, that's actually a good thing, ladies and gentlemen. The biggest desiccation is when you have a massive number of people being unemployed at the same time. That's when you lead to structural problems where the whole town is devastated, ladies and gentlemen. We'd rather that corporations have to make these redundancies than do them over a longer period of time.
Sir.
No, thank you. Now let's look at this issue of the withdrawal timeline, how this changes the way corporations withdraw. So what we heard from Swain, ladies and gentlemen, is that there's already an incentive to take your time with your withdrawal. We say that under the status quo, where you don't have to pay a cost for the immense dislocation to that society, there's an incentive to do it faster. We want to place a cost on doing it faster. We want to place a cost on withdrawing precipitously. No, thank you. Moreover, let's look at this issue of the incentive to upskill workers. So what we heard from Swain is that this hinders the shift to more productive industries. We say it accelerates it, ladies and gentlemen. When we say car manufacturers know that if they have to move production, they have to bear the cost. They have more incentive to train their workers to be able to compete in, say, green industries, ladies and gentlemen, which often rely on the same product, steel. We say that incentive changes in terms of the kind of skills that they develop. No, thank you. Furthermore, let's look at this issue of opening factories, finally within this theme, ladies and gentlemen. So what we heard from the opening opposition is that this is going to make companies less willing to actually open their institutions. We say two things to that. Firstly, our case supports the same regulations in all comparable countries. So there's no competitive advantage, ladies and gentlemen, in not opening in a particular country. But moreover, ladies and gentlemen, when corporations make the decision to invest, they're not predicting massive layoffs once they enter that particular market. There's a range of other factors that go into deciding whether they decide to invest. No, thank you. So, finally, do companies have an obligation to pay? What we heard from the opposition is that they have a right to the fair share of the profits. But that approaches this issue in an absolute vacuum. A fair share of profits would reflect both the benefits derived from the state and the social burden imposed on the state when these people leave. So what we've told you about is the benefits derived from the state from exclusive control over a particular area, exclusive control over the labour, exclusive control over the infrastructure. This is a key point that hasn't really been responded to. But looking at the social burden if they leave, ladies and gentlemen, the key point here is that the state wears an immense burden that isn't purely quantified by the welfare payments, but by the social unrest, by the immediate spectre of a huge number of people that need to depend on welfare programs. We said that immense cost that is imposed singularly by corporations is significant. And this particularly when corporations tailor these towns around people being skilled in particular sectors. So retraining takes so long and is so much more difficult, ladies and gentlemen. Taxation is insufficient because of the scale of the harm associated with corporations leaving and because of the difficulty of redressing a whole town's dependence on a particular industry. We say that's simply an externality like any other externality, like environmental pollution, ladies and gentlemen, which still should be recognised by the state. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, everyone recognises the major cost paid. We say that corporations' complicity in setting up the structures that lead to these costs and the burden that they face, therefore, to remedy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for his comments. Now we come back and ask